You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
What does Sputnik have to do with student loans? How did a set of trembling hands end the Soviet Union? How did inflation kill moon bases? And how did a former president decide to run for a second non-consecutive term? These are among the topics we deal with on the My History Can Beat Up Your Politics podcast. We tell stories of history that relate to today's news events. Give a listen. My History Can Beat Up Your Politics, wherever you get podcasts.
Warren came straight toward the head of the regiment. He called out to O'Rourke, beginning to speak while still some 8 or 10 rods from us, that he wanted us to come up there, that the enemy were advancing unopposed up the opposite side of the hill down which he had just come, and he wanted our regiment to meet them. He was evidently greatly excited, and spoke in his usual impulsive style. O'Rourke answered, "General Weed is ahead, and expects me to follow him." "Never mind that," said Warren. "Bring your regiment up here, and I will take the responsibility." It was a perplexing situation, but without hesitating, O'Rourke turned to the left. We rushed along the wooded, rocky eastern slope of Little Round Top.
We were moving with not a musket loaded, a fact which of course Warren knew nothing about when he rushed us up there. The enemy was coming from our right. O'Rourke did not hesitate a moment. "Dismount," he said to me, for the ground before us was too rough to ride over. We sprang from our horses and gave them to the sergeant major. O'Rourke shouted, "Down this way, boys," and following him we rushed down the rocky slope. Coming abreast of Vincent's brigade, and taking advantage of such shelter as the huge rocks lying about there afforded, the men loaded and fired, and in less time than it takes to write it, the onslaught of the rebels was fairly checked, and in a few minutes the woods in front of us were cleared except of the dead and wounded. The firing for a few minutes was very rapid, and the execution on both sides fearful. O'Rourke exposed himself with the greatest gallantry, not taking the least advantage of the partial shelter which the rocks afforded. He was shot in the neck and dropped instantly dead without a word. Lieutenant Porter Farley, Adjutant, 140th New York, Weed's Brigade, Ayres Division, 5th Corps.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to the 350th episode of our Civil War podcast. I'm Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello, y'all. Welcome to the podcast.
All right, let's pick right back up where we left off last time. And where we left off last time, of course, would be the fight for Little Round Top. As you guys will recall, on the Confederate side, the 4th Alabama of Law's Brigade and the 4th and 5th Texas of Robertson's Brigade kicked off the brawl for that key piece of high ground on the southern end of the battlefield by hitting the center and right of the Federal position on the hill, but they were driven back. Officers reformed them, and they lurched forward a second time, and for a second time they were stopped and then driven back by the heavy Federal defensive fire that slammed down the hillside at them. But more Confederate troops soon arrived on the scene, in the form of the other regiments of Law's Brigade, the 15th and 47th Alabama, led by Colonel William Oates.
As y'all recall, the Federals defending Little Round Top were from Strong Vincent's Brigade of Barnes' Division from Sykes' 5th Corps. They were there because George Meade had ordered his old corps, the 5th, to rush to the southern end of the Union line at Gettysburg after Meade discovered that Dan Sickles had blundered by moving the 3rd Corps up to an extremely precarious forward line.
Vincent's position there on Little Round Top was held from right to left by the 16th Michigan, 44th New York, 83rd Pennsylvania, and 20th Maine. They arrived on the hill and got themselves situated, quite literally in the nick of time, with about 15 minutes to spare before the 4th Alabama and the 4th and 5th Texas came up and launched their first attack.
Those first two Confederate attacks on Little Round Top by the 4th Alabama and 4th and 5th Texas struck the center and right of Vincent's line, and both times the rebels were repulsed. But when the 15th and 47th Alabama, led by Colonel Oates, arrived on the scene, Oates' instructions were to locate, quote, the left of the Union line, to turn it and do all the damage I could.
It wasn't long before Oates and his men found that left end of the Union line. As the weary soldiers of these two Alabama regiments approached the saddle between the two Round Tops, coming into the right of the 4th Alabama, they were greeted, quote, by the most destructive fire, end quote, that Oates had ever seen. He would also later remember how his line, quote, wavered like a man trying to walk against a strong wind.
Much of the fire that welcomed Oates and his Alabamans to the fight came from the left of the 83rd Pennsylvania and from Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine, there on Vincent's left. Private Elisha Cohn of the 20th remembered that the regiment's line, quote, burst into flames, and the crash of musketry became constant.
Recovering from that initial blast, Oates' men lost no time in returning the Federal fire, and the fight for Little Round Top now raged all along the length of Vincent's brigade line.
As Strong Vincent's men were slugging it out with the Texans and Alabamans on the western and southern sides of the hill, the gunners of Lieutenant Charles Hazlett's Battery D, 5th United States Artillery, were just then laboring up the opposite side of the hilltop, straining to get to their pieces to the rocky summit.
It was an exceptionally tough task, too much for the horses alone to handle. The artillerists therefore had to help shoulder the burden, pushing and pulling the cannons up the hill, over the rocks and between the trees, to the summit. Gouverneur Warren thought that Hazlett's guns would be of little use. There was precious little room to deploy them, Warren explained, and besides, their barrels couldn't be depressed enough to fire at the Confederate infantry attacking up the hillside. "Never mind that," replied Hazlett. "The sound of my guns will be encouraging to our troops and disheartening to the others, and my battery's of no use if this hill is lost."
Unable to argue with that logic, and no doubt impressed by Hazlett's determination, Warren helped the battery commander position the 6 guns, which soon began throwing shot and shell at the rebel infantry swarming up and over Devil's Den and into the Plum Run Valley below.
With Hazlett's guns going into position, Warren, who was bleeding from a neck wound, raced down the hillside seeking more troops to secure Little Round Top. Near the base of the hill, he happened upon the 140th New York, led by Colonel Patrick O'Rourke. The 140th belonged to Weed's brigade of Ayer's division in the 5th Corps, and O'Rourke had halted it while Stephen Weed rode ahead for orders.
That's when Warren galloped up. As luck would have it, Gouverneur Warren and Patrick O'Rourke knew each other. "Patty, give me a regiment," Warren exclaimed. O'Rourke hesitated. He explained that he was waiting for Weed to return with orders. The desperate Warren said, "Never mind that. Bring your regiment up here, and I will take the responsibility."
That was enough for O'Rourke, and besides, Warren's voice made it clear that there was no time to lose. So O'Rourke led the 140th up Little Round Top, arriving on the summit just in time to help throw back yet another Confederate assault and destabilize Vincent's wavering line.
The 4th and 5th Texas and 4th Alabama would not be denied. Twice they had surged up the hillside, and twice they had been repulsed, but they were now forming up to try it for a third time.
By this time, the rebels had secured Devil's Den. Ward's Federals had been driven back, as had the 40th New York and 6th New Jersey, 2 regiments that had been sent to Ward's assistance from de Trobriand's and Burling's brigades, respectively. Now, with Oates' 15th and 47th Alabama heavily engaged on their right, and with the soldiers of the 48th Alabama and other regiments advancing into the Plum Run Valley to their left, the men of the 4th and 5th Texas crept steadily once more out of the trees, their piercing rebel yells heard above the roar of battle.
Again, the Texans ran into a sheet of flame poured down the hillside at them from the muskets of the Federal defenders, but joined by some of the 48th Alabama, the men from the Lone Star State pressed on up the rocky hill farther than their previous 2 attempts, encouraged in their advance by what appeared to be the collapse of Vincent's right flank.
That's because trouble had developed within the 16th Michigan, and that trouble threatened to unhinge Vincent's entire line. You see, during their advance up the hillside, the Texans and Alabamans worked their way around the exposed right of the Michigan regiment, and the bullets soon came crashing into the 16th from 2 directions. Then, for reasons that aren't quite clear, an officer of the regiment ordered the color bearer to fall back up the hillside, and with the flag went about 1/3 of the 16th Michigan.
Seeing part of the 16th Michigan inexplicably withdraw up the hillside, Vincent raced over to his now crumbling right flank. While exhorting the men to rally and stand fast, strong Vincent was struck down, mortally wounded. He would die 5 days later.
At that desperate moment, it seemed as if the surging Confederates would turn Vincent's right flank. But racing up at that instant were Patrick O'Rourke and the hard-charging men of the 140th New York, sweeping over the summit of Little Round Top and straight into the deadly whirlwind of battle that swirled on the hilltop. One New York officer later said they came upon a scene, quote, very much like hell itself.
The men at the head of the 140th column charged down the hillside and directly toward the surging Texans and Alabamans, with O'Rourke leading the rush, shouting, "Down this way, boys."
The New Yorkers ran straight into a murderous sheet of musketry that felled almost a quarter of them, but their timely entrance into the fight tipped the balance once more toward the defenders, and it was too much for the winded Texans and Alabamans to bear. After a Herculean effort, they fell back, driven from the slopes of Little Round Top for the final time.
Very quickly the tide had turned, and the right of Vincent's line was secured. But the cost was high. Vincent had already fallen with his mortal wound, and O'Rourke, first in his West Point class of 1861, had fallen, shot through the neck at the moment of his regiment's triumph. However, even as affairs were settling down on Vincent's right, the bloody contest had yet to be decided on the opposite end of the line, where the fighting still raged.
Did archaeologists discover Noah's Ark?
Is the rapture coming as soon as the Euphrates River dries up?
Does the Bible condemn abortion?
Don't you wish you had a trustworthy academic resource to help make sense of all of this?
Well, I'm Dan Beecher, and he's award-winning Bible scholar and TikTok sensation Dr. Dan McClellan, and we want to invite you to the Data Over Dogma podcast,
where our mission is to increase public access to the academic study of the Bible and religion, and also to combat the spread of misinformation about the same.
But, in a fun way.
Every week we tackle fascinating topics, we go back to source materials in their original languages,
and we interview top scholars in the field.
So whether you're a devout believer,
or you're just interested in a clear-eyed, deeply informed look at one of the most influential books of all time,
we think you're going to love the Data Over Dogma podcast,
wherever you subscribe to awesome shows.
What's something you learned in history class that you feel wasn't the whole truth? Better yet, what's something you didn't learn at all that was omitted completely. That's what I'd like to call redacted history. I believe that all history, no matter how good or bad, needs to be told. There are wars, massacres, battles, and entire historical events that are just not in our school's history books. Have you ever heard of Mary Bowser? I didn't think so. My name is Andre White, the host of the Redacted History Podcast, the place where history's forgotten events, heroes, and villains get their story told, one episode at a time. So come huddle around the campfire with me and get ready to hear the stories that you were robbed of. And get comfortable. We're going to be here a while. The Redacted History Podcast. Real history never dies. Stream the Redacted History Podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
How can I describe the scenes that followed? Imagine, if you can, 9 small companies of infantry in the form of a right angle on the extreme flank of an army, put there to hold the key of the entire position. Stand firm, ye boys from Maine, for not once in a century are men permitted to bear such responsibilities as are now placed upon you.
The conflict opens. I know not who gave the first fire. I only know that the carnage began. Our regiment was mantled in fire and smoke. I wish that I could picture the awful details of that hour, how rapidly the cartridges were torn from the boxes and stuffed in the smoking muzzles of the guns.
How the steel rammers clashed and clanged in the heated barrels. How the men's hands and faces grew grim and black with burning powder.
How our little line, baptized with fire, reeled to and fro as it advanced or was pressed back. How our officers bravely encouraged the men to hold on and recklessly expose themselves to the enemy's fire.
A terrible medley of cries, shouts, cheers, groans, prayers, curses, bursting shells, whizzing rifle bullets, and clanging steel. Private Theodore Garish, 20th Maine, Vincent's Brigade, Barnes Division, 5th Corps.
The 15th and 47th Alabama had been keeping up a steady pressure on the 20th Maine, even though these Alabamans were parched and well nigh worn out. With his ranks rapidly thinning, Colonel Oates increasingly found himself in a bad spot. His 2 regiments constituted the extreme right flank of the Confederate Army, and they had nothing in the way of support. Because Benning's Georgia Brigade had followed behind Robertson and attacked Devil's Den, there was no one moving up behind Oates' Alabamans.
Worse, following the repulse of their attack, the soldiers of the 4th Alabama and 4th and 5th Texas began to withdraw from Oates' immediate left, leaving the colonel and his Alabamans alone. But Oates wasn't yet ready to call it quits. Instead, the determined colonel began sidestepping the 15th Alabama to the right, seeking to turn the flank of the 20th Maine, there on the far left of the Union position on Little Round Top.
Oates' counterpart, 34-year-old Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a pre-war professor of rhetoric at Bowdoin College in Maine, was having his own troubles. He, too, was losing men left and right, and his soldiers were running out of bullets. One Maine soldier wrote, "The air seemed to be alive with lead."
With Oates' Alabamans repeatedly making their way up the hillside, another of Chamberlain's men later recalled how, quote, "Again and again this mad rush repeated, each time to be beaten off by the ever-thinning line that desperately clung to its ledge of rock."
Having been admonished by Strong Vincent to hold his ground to the last, Chamberlain was determined to do so, though it was becoming increasingly more difficult.
Chamberlain noticed that the enemy was working their way around his left flank. In response, he refused that flank, stretching his thin line and turning it back on itself at a near 90-degree angle so that his beleaguered regiment came to resemble a V, with the men on his left facing east, while those on his right continued to face south. Then, once more, Oates Alabamans surged up the hillside, getting to within a few dozen paces of Chamberlain's tenuous line. In some spots, for a few brief moments, the combat was hand-to-hand. But, said Chamberlain, quote, "The terrible effectiveness of our fire compelled them to break and take shelter."
Nevertheless, Chamberlain judged that his men wouldn't be able to withstand any more attacks. Never once considering falling back, he yelled for his men to fix bayonets. Chamberlain, believing that it was his only option, readied them to charge down the hillside. Private Garish would later write, quote, "Our ammunition is nearly all gone, and we are using the cartridges from the boxes of our wounded comrades. A critical moment has arrived, and we can remain as we are no longer. We must advance or retreat. It must not be the latter, but how can it be the former? Colonel Chamberlain understands how it can be done. The order is given, fix bayonets, and the steel shanks of the bayonets rattle upon the rifle barrels."
At the same time that Chamberlain was ordering his men to fix bayonets, Colonel Oates, at the base of the hill, decided that enough was enough. The Union position was too strong, his men were too tired, and his casualties too heavy. Oates would later write, quote, "My dead and wounded were then nearly as great in number as those still on duty. They literally covered the ground. The blood stood in puddles in some places on the rocks. The ground was soaked with the blood of as brave men as ever fell on the red field of battle. Lieutenant John A. Oates, my dear brother, was pierced through by a number of bullets and fell mortally wounded."
Oates had sent to his left for help, only to learn that all the friendly troops there had fallen back. Sensing his isolation and despairing of any support, Oates decided to retreat. Just as William Oates passed the word to fall back to his officers, a shout was heard, and the hard-charging soldiers of the 20th Maine came rushing down the hill, through the trees, their bayonets leveled before them. Oates admitted that his worn-out men ran, quote, "like a herd of wild cattle."
Dozens of Alabamans were rounded up and sent to the rear as prisoners, while those who were able scampered up the wooded slopes of Big Round Top to safety. Utterly spent by the exertions of the day, Oates fainted as he made his way back, but was carried off by some of his men before he could fall into enemy hands.
Chamberlain called off the charge, and his men returned to their position, while what remained of Oates' command continued retreating to safety. And with that, after a desperate struggle, the bloody brawl for Little Round Top was over.
As we said in the last show, the story of what Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain and his 20th Maine did on the slopes of Little Round Top has captured the public imagination, thanks largely to Michael Shera's Pulitzer Prize-winning 1975 novel, The Killer Angels, and Gettysburg, the 1993 movie based on the book. And there's no doubt what happened on Little Round Top is a fascinating story, one filled with many exciting, anxious moments, including the Maine men on the far left of the Union line beating back repeated Confederate attacks before running out of bullets and ultimately resorting to the bayonet in their defense of the hilltop.
The belief that all would have been lost for the Federals at Gettysburg had the 20th Maine faltered remains firmly entrenched in the public imagination. However, in recent years, another viewpoint has gained traction. This one suggesting that it's extremely doubtful that a few hundred thoroughly exhausted Confederates, without any support, would have actually been able to achieve much, even if the 20th Maine had been driven from its position.
Had the 20th Maine fallen back, Oates still would have had to contend with the rest of Vincent's brigade, and the Alabamans would have rather quickly found Little Round Top swarming with additional Federal troops. Hazlett's guns were there, as was the 140th New York, and the rest of Weed's brigade, since even as the action was concluding on the southern slopes of the hill, Weed was arriving and placing his remaining 3 regiments across the hilltop's western face.
In addition, Samuel Crawford's 5th Corps Division arrived soon after on the northern shoulder of the hilltop, followed by the entirety of Sedgwick's 6th Corps, 13,000 men strong. All of that's to say, there were ample Federal troops on hand to have regained the hill if it had been taken by Oates' Alabamans.
Perhaps Oates said it best when, after the war, he wrote, quote, "Had I succeeded in capturing Little Round Top, isolated as I was, I could not have held it 10 minutes."
In his book, Confrontation at Gettysburg, John David Hoptack writes, quote, "The tenacious defense and gallant charge of the 20th Maine was heroic, but Little Round Top was secured not by the actions of a single officer or those of a single regiment. It was, instead, a collective effort that began with Warren and continued with the likes of Vincent, Hazlett, O'Rourke, Chamberlain, Weed, and the men of their various commands."
Hoptack continues, writing, "Vincent and O'Rourke had given their lives in defense of the hilltop. So too would Hazlett and Weed. As the action subsided, a bullet tore through General Weed, and he fell to the ground, paralyzed from the neck down and mortally wounded. Hazlett was killed moments later when a bullet ripped through his head. The Union Army lost a number of gifted and promising young officers, but their efforts had all helped to ensure that Little Round Top would remain firmly in Federal hands.
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation, and our recommendation this time is Little Round Top, A Detailed Tour Guide by Gary E. Edelman.
Edelman's name is probably familiar to many of you in connection with the American Battlefield Trust. We also recently recommended his and Timothy H. Smith's guide on Devil's Den. Gary Edelman has also authored a book titled The Myth of Little Round Top, but when we checked Amazon as we were preparing this episode, we saw that used copies of that out-of-print book were being offered for between $700 and $900, which, of course, is just laughably ridiculous. But, every once in a while, we've noticed that you come across something like that with out-of-print titles, and you have to wonder, what on earth? Who would be such an idiot to pay that much for a book like that? However, in a related topic, if you'd like to purchase a nice, gently used copy of The Myth of Little Round Top, we'd be happy to let ours go for the low, low price of $699.99.
Okay. At any rate, don't forget you can find a list of all of our book recommendations if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find information about joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon, just like Russ G., Greg H., Ed W., James M., Owen R., James D., and Seth D. have done recently. Thanks, gentlemen.
At the website, you can also make a one-time donation, which Daniel R., William B., and Anthony W. have done recently. Thanks, guys.
And that's it for this show. Thanks for listening to this episode of The Civil War, 1861 to 1865, a history podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, when we'll look at the brutal slugfest that was the fight for Farmer John Rose's wheat field. But until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.